Welcome back to the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. I'm your host, Thomas J. Farmer, joined as always by my co-host, Raymond Perrier.
What's up?
And Michael Granato.
Hello.
That's going to have to be recorded again.
No, I'm trying to approach it with the curiosity of a child. So I was channeling the inner
You
child.
sound like a horror movie character.
Hello. I think it works.
Oh.
Philosophy begins in wonder, childlike wonder.
Oh, man, and it ends with that voice.
At least our podcast does.
All right, so today our topic is facts versus opinions. So we need to establish, I think, first and foremost, what a fact is versus what an opinion is. Because these days, all right, so the problem is, these days there seems to be a lot of opinions out there. And how do you distinguish a so-called fact from just what someone wants the world to be?
Yeah.
So since Michael's going to disagree with everything we have to say,
Naturally.
Raymond, why don't you start us off? What do you think a fact is?
We can separate facts first and foremost. Probably we're talking about in terms of opinions, and then I think we should also talk about facts distinct from something like a belief, because I think that opinions and beliefs are different. Facts, probably I would say the simplest and the most commonly understood definition would be something that exists and something that is true or real. So let's dive into that a little bit with a little bit more nuance. So when we think that, something exists or something is real or something is true, what is sort of the criteria that we use to make these assertions and these judgments? That's what I would like to sort of pose as the question. We can talk about things from experience. We can talk about things from observation. We observe things to be true. We experience things to be true. And then we relay these things to other people as facts, as things that have occurred historically, as things that have the ability to be repeated, like in the scientific community. And and in that sense, I think that that's sort of the basis of what we think a fact is, just sort of like in common parlance, common discussions.
All right, let me give what I think is the standard view on this vis-a-vis like epistemology, study of knowledge.
Oh, Lord.
And then, of course, Michael will attempt to poke holes in all this. So, now, this isn't necessarily, I mean, I think that this is reasonably defensible, and at some point, anything can be problematized. So,
Yeah.
but the standard view on this is essentially to say that our knowledge of something depends upon there being something external to ourselves. Right? There's an external world, and that our beliefs about the world can be no different than opinion, but a belief and an opinion are the kind of the ways in which we actually use those words. Is a belief can be something much more defensible, and opinion is just a judgment arrived at with no real recourse to anything. So if I have just an opinion about something, it could be less informed. But if I say I believe something, I tend to mean that I have a conviction about something. Now, when stated about empirical reality, the sort of things that you could go out and investigate, right? So not a priori claims, the sort of things that you don't have to investigate, like 2 + 2 = 4, right? You don't have to go and look at every instance of twos and twos jumbled together in order to make 4. It's just something that you know based upon the ways in which things operate. Same thing goes with like tautologies to say that red is red. Well, of course it is, because what else would it be? Those are kind of analytic truth claims. But when it comes to facts versus your beliefs about them, we tend to refer to facts as just states of affairs, things out in the world, the way that the world is in and for itself. And then the truth about your belief is about its conformity to states of affairs, right? So if I say it's raining outside, that has a truth claim in it. It's the sort of thing that is either true or false or indeterminate, right? A claim that would be indeterminate would be something like, it's going to rain tomorrow. Well, we have to wait till tomorrow to find out whether or not that claim is true or false. But it's the sort of thing that it's an indicative statement. It's the sort of thing that you can look at. And so trying to establish the truth of something is essentially trying to establish the conditions under which you can claim with justification that your beliefs map onto reality. So it is, in fact, raining outside versus it is not raining outside. And that's not just an opinion, right? It's the sort of thing that could, in principle, be established. It can be verified. Now, there are certain claims which are non-empirical in nature, vis-a-vis things like personhood, right? That's a metaphysical entity. What would it mean to say that you're a person? Well, that involves a kind of judgment which is not empirical in nature. You can't look at personhood under a microscope. So whatever judgment you have about it is not based on empirical claims. But the sort of empirical claims that we talk about when we discuss facts, those are the sorts of things which, at least in theory, you can go and look at. They can be false. And I think that one of the pernicious features of today is the problematizing of the nature of facts. To say, well, there is no facts, there's just opinion, or there's just interpretations. Well, there's some truth to that, right? The world is not just completely we always come to the world as interpreters. But part of the collective enterprise of language and just community is to say there are some things that we have to be able to agree upon. And empirical reality, utilizing the tools of like probability, right? I think that's a good place to start in terms of distinguishing mere judgments based upon nothing versus what we want to call facts.
I think that an opinion rests on something that's just it's not structured in an argumentative or demonstrative fashion. That's and we should talk about that. But Mike, I want to hear what you have to say about
the truth,
his interpretation of facts, since you're the philosophy of science guru out of the three of us.
Yeah, well, I want to start off by saying this is the second time we've done this podcast because, and that the first time we did it, Jared started off with all these highfalutin, nonsensical definitions about what a fact is and what an opinion is. And I was like, man, this is just so bad. No one's going to want to listen to this shit. And then it made Jared upset and like he started crying and stuff. So we had to.
I cried a little bit. It hurt.
We had to go
so
back
much.
and do it again. No, I mean, I think I can't really remember most of what Jared said, but I'm in general agreement with it.
I think you were just being cantankerous that day. You were in the mood to just be difficult, and you didn't want to agree with anybody, and so you thought it was
I mean, we have to be so there's I think there's two stages to this that I want to point out. First of all, I think we have to be mindful of all the philosophical jargon that we use, but also people on the same hand have to realize that a lot of these words are philosophically loaded and carry with it a lot of baggage. So when we talk about stuff like reality or even facts or like basic correspondence theory of truth, which is kind of what Jared was laying out there. If you want to go Google that, look it up.
Yeah.
Or like what is real, all of that carries with it. All that for philosophers sends up a lot of red flags. And a lot of times we'll say, okay, well, let's stop there and talk about what is reality? What do we mean by reality? What do we mean what does it mean for something to exist? Right. But yeah, on a just an introductory, just straightforward. So I was actually having this conversation with a friend of mine because his daughter, who was in elementary school, brought home homework, and her homework was distinguishing fact from opinion. And I was like, oh, that's nice. But what they teach it's a really important lesson, but it's something that like we take as like elementary, and it's something that we take like,
Yeah,
oh, this is
yeah,
for like kids to learn, but as adults we just kind of stop thinking about it, which I think probably leads to some of the problems we're facing today. But back to facts real quick. I would start off with a somewhat controversial philosophical statement, and I'll use some stupid wording here, and I'll go back and explain it. But I would say that first and foremost, all facts are contingent, and what I mean by that is within science, to say something is a fact is to say that that thing is first and foremost supported by a lot of evidence. That evidence can be empirical evidence, like Jared was talking about, but that evidence can also be mathematical reasoning, which isn't necessarily empirical, but that's a debate for another day.
Well, that's what I said, something like a priori truth claims,
Yeah.
which is another fancy way of just saying like the sort of things that you know without having to investigate. So they're non-empirical, but it doesn't mean that you can just decide that it's what I want to believe. It's based
Right.
on mathematical reasoning or the rules of logic.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted your train of thought. Go ahead.
No, it was fine. So that being said, facts are contingent, and what that means is that for something to be a fact, to have the label of fact, facts operate on a sliding scale of truth, so to speak. So I like to think about it like a balancing scale. Is something a fact? Depends upon how much evidence. You can't see what I'm doing. It probably wouldn't help if you could, but I'm moving
Just
my
imagine a
arms back and
scale,
forth.
or just imagine Michael flailing his arms crazily.
Imagine a scale, or just me just flailing around. So whether or not something is true depends on how much evidence that thing has for its truthness, so to speak. And this applies not just to science, but I think it applies to almost everything, even what we encounter in our day-to-day lives. So if I said, for example, is my car red? Or my car is red, to state it positively, that my car is red, that's a fact. Well, how do you know that that's a fact? What sort of evidence do you have to support that being a fact? Do I have a car? What color is my car? All sorts of things kind of factor into that. But I think it's important to point out that the common conception of facts, and we deal a lot of what philosophers try to do is to get around these the common ideas that we have about things. And one of the common ideas that we have about things that I'd like to point out is that we have this common conception that facts are like immutable, that facts are concrete, that facts don't change. And at least within a scientific setting, that's not true.
Well, I think a different way of saying it is just to say that our ideas about the world are always provisional.
Mm-hmm.
They're always subject to change just because we're moving closer to something, right? So, to utilize an example, I think a good place to start would be Thomas Kuhn. Ideas should be based upon current scientific consensus, and the current scientific consensus is built upon the best available information that you have at the present time. Now, this is part of the reason why I don't like the idea of kind of a historical snobbery where people presume that they're so much more clever than people in the past. Well, we just have more information. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're more or less clever than anybody in the period of history. It just means that we have much more to work with. So if you take something like Newtonian physics, right, is a very good theory. It's a very good theory that worked well for a long period of time. And it was only ever displaced by relativity because relativity explained the same phenomenon better. Now, does that mean that Newton and the people that followed him were wrong? Well, in a sense, but they were within their rights to believe what they did because it was based upon the best, most current information that they had. It would have been intellectually irresponsible for them not to have believed what they did at the time in which they believed it.
Right.
Just like it would be intellectually irresponsible to believe a strict Newtonian view of the universe today, knowing what we know about general relativity. Defensibility of certain claims comes down to what sort of evidence do you have and when do you have it.
Yeah.
If you believe something, if you find out later that you were mistaken, I think that there's nothing necessarily wrong with that.
There shouldn't be.
Well, no, what I mean is if you think about Socrates' position, where he compares the person who is ignorant of something to a sick person, right? If you have a wrong opinion about something or a wrong set of beliefs about something, then the philosopher or whoever has better information, you should see them as a physician there who's there to restore you. So why would you treat that person with resistance, right? It would be as silly as a sick person pushing away a physician. Don't get mad when someone corrects you. They're there to help you. They're there to help fill out your picture of the world.
Right.
What I often tell my students is we're all operating with an incomplete set of data. And part of the task of learning is to help fill in the blanks. That's why you always need other people, because even if you're looking at essentially the same information, perhaps they have life experience which allows them to see a different dimension of it that you otherwise could not see. And so, in order to get at a more complete picture of the world, we need to talk to other people, especially people who disagree with us, because maybe they see some blind alleyway that we've missed somehow.
We should definitely tie this back to something more colloquial, though, because I feel like it's a very ideal, and well, like we were saying,
Yeah.
people tend to think of it as immutable, as absolute, and then at the same time, on the opposite spectrum, people tend to think of facts as basically opinions, one or the other. We should ask the question, like, why is there a divide? Like, what's at the root of the distinction here? On the one hand, facts as something immutable and absolute, and something on the other hand, because what we're trying to say is that there's something in between that people aren't getting
Yes.
outside of the higher levels of academia, which is really strange, because saying that facts are going to change and that they are true insofar as they are demonstrable or indicative of like a current state of affairs seems pretty straightforward, and yet still we suffer from this degree of switching the pendulum from being either everybody's facts are different, right? Well, those are your facts, those are your piece, which basically just means that they're all opinions, and then go in the opposite direction, that no, this is absolutely true, nothing could contradict it. So let's break
Yeah.
those down a little bit more and talk about that relationship a little.
Right. Yeah. You want to go first, Jared?
I'll take a stab at it, but
Good luck.
I mean, well, here's the thing. So on one side, we are recognizing that as information changes, right, what we take to be facts at the moment, we can build a more complete picture of. And so maybe our, at least interpretations of states of affairs change. Perhaps states of affairs don't change, but perhaps we get a clearer picture of them as we go along, which means that our interpretation has changed.
Yeah.
Now, how is that different from saying that, well, then everything's just opinion? Well, it's because you don't have intellectual responsibility to just dismiss everything and say, well, I'll believe whatever I want to. If I can't know the absolute truth about everything, then I get to just pick and choose whatever I want to believe, and I'm within my rights to do so. Yeah, I mean, you can believe whatever you want to. The issue is whether or not you should be able to convince anyone to take you seriously, and I just don't think that you can, because you can ultimately be wrong about something, but have been correct in terms of making your judgments based upon the best, most current information that you had. To say that any responsible judgment that I can come to is built upon my interpretation of the information that I have at the present moment, weighed against all the available evidence, and what I, as a critical thinker who is disciplined in my reason and my use of logic, have come to a sound decision about something.
And then if
Now
you
we just
don't,
have to recognize that we're finite.
yeah, I think this gets back to sort of the moral implications of the burden of trying to differentiate between facts and opinions. Because if you're an individual and you're on a social media platform, or you're like a news anchor or a journalist or something, and you have a set of facts that you're arguing for or using in an argument, then the question becomes one of credibility. Are your facts standing in contradistinction to somebody else's? And if you're proven wrong, how do you respond to that? Do you take responsibility for it? I think that that what we're trying to say is that, yeah, you take responsibility for it and you move on with life, because we're finite, and there's only so much that we can know with certainty. And there are instances where facts are revealed to people, and we have to sift through, that we have to basically certify them and verify that they are genuine facts, because they're being couched as facts in this moment, and they may not be, a day from now, if we, upon further research. So there's certainly a temporal factor to this, that in time, as a human being that exists within time, we have limits on what we can know at any given moment, and that we have moral responsibility, so to speak, to decide whether or not what we know is true in a way that could be applied to everybody else around us, or isn't true, and as such should either be held as an opinion or transformed into some kind of belief within your system of belief, or you
Mm.
just move on from it and
You know,
forget it
there's
altogether because it's not that
Let
important to
me,
you.
yeah, there's the.
yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, I just want to,
Jump in,
because
Mike.
Raymond, there's a few things that you said that made me think about this, and I've been thinking about it for a while now, because it's really strange to me what happened, and this might be a little bit of a tangent or whatnot, but it's in our climate today. You may have heard people refer to the time what we're living in today as a post-truth or a
Yeah, yeah.
post-fact society.
I think the actual term should be ignorant, but
Ignorant. I think it's applicable, because what's interesting to me is that people nowadays, there's like and I can't quite put my finger on it, but it's sort of like a conspiracy theory. Like, people nowadays believe that facts can somehow be tainted by one's political
mm-hmm.
position or by one's like ideological beliefs. But not only that facts can be tainted, but that as a result of that, like, evidence is basically like out the window. And so the result of that is it leads us with relativistic position, where we can't even agree upon what what normally would be normally, quote unquote, would be considered a fact.
Yeah.
That somehow, so I see this all the time, because I deal with, I don't, well, I guess I do deal with it, but I'm also extremely interested in science denial, for example.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
you see this a lot in science denial with all sorts of issues. I mean, hell, nowadays people are talking about like whether or not the Earth is round.
I know,
But
right?
probably more pertinent, politically speaking, you have this with, especially like with climate change,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
you have people who. So we just had this whole spiel about like what constitute a fact, but for some reason, when we bring this into the political realm, all of that's thrown out the window, and we no longer accept that definition of fact. That's what's interesting to me. What's happening now with this fact and opinion dichotomy that we're talking about here. I don't know if y'all want to speak to that, or if y'all see what I'm saying or not, but
I think that a lot of this has to do with worldviews. So this might take a minute for me to elaborate all upon, so just hang with me for just a second. So I think that by the time you reach adulthood, you have a stable worldview for the most part, which means that you have learned a lot of things, whether those are correct or not. You have basically a way of framing any new information that you gather. So any new information which is presented to you, you run through implicitly, you run this through your worldview, through this frame of reference that you have. Now, the problem is that whenever you're introduced to information which contradicts this worldview that you've built, you have a choice at that moment, implicitly. I'm not saying that people consciously do this. If it conforms to what you already think, then it's easier for you to accept that information, which, whether the information is correct or not, is irrelevant, right? If it conforms to what you already think, then you just kind of store it away. You don't think about it anymore. If information contradicts what you think about the world, your frame of reference, then you have to decide whether or not you're going to accept it. And if you accept it, then that means that you may have to move some things around, right? You have to deal with the possibility that it's going to cause you to question other
Yeah.
beliefs. And that is difficult, right? It's difficult. And so, as absurd as it seems, if you do a cost benefit analysis on what to do with uncomfortable information, it's just easier to dismiss it. You dismiss the information, which means that you don't have to change anything.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it is just an effect of being lazy, right?
Yeah, it's intellectual laziness,
Yeah,
but it's built on things like sorts of implicit biases, right?
yeah, yeah,
So we all have cognitive biases where we cherry pick information which conforms to what we already think. So the general process of coming to a belief, what most people think happens is they gather a bunch of information and then disinterestedly decide what they think on a particular topic. That's almost never how we actually come to a belief. More often than not, we have
Mm-hmm.
beliefs based on just a number of
Right.
incidental things, partly tied to our environment. And then we cherry pick information which conforms to it and then rationalize the belief post hoc after the fact.
yeah,
We know that we do this. It's one of the
Mm-hmm.
hallmarks of like human thinking that we are susceptible to all sorts of cognitive biases. But when it comes to things like fact v opinion, also this is built, I think, from the fact that we are living in the information age. Now it's just much easier. It's much easier to curate your own worldview,
yeah,
right? As I said,
yeah,
you can cherry pick information. Well,
yeah,
in the information age, it's not that hard to go out and find things which conform to what you think. And especially with the current media landscape,
yeah,
you can listen to news services which won't contradict what you think. You can find people from all walks of life. You can build new communities around your own ignorance. And then you create echo chambers, little protective castles, right? Where no one tells you that what you think is problematic in some way.
And I think it's worth acknowledging that, I called it intellectual laziness. And then sometimes, I think it is, and oftentimes it probably is. But there's also just the sheer fact that there's so much information to determine what is true and what is not, given the amount of data points we have been given today based off of technology and, the World Wide Web and all of the different news agencies that are cropping up here and there, and YouTube channels and journal articles and blog posts. It's a lot of information to take into account, and we were talking about needing to take all of these supposed facts, sift through them, and then somehow certify them. The average person just has no access to the original data to do that, and so you have to trust the people presenting it to you. And it's really hard to determine where does this trust get built from.
Now, there was an article a while back, a few years ago. It was by an Australian philosopher named Patrick Stokes, and it wasn't like it wasn't a scholarly article. It was a popular article that he wrote, which was uh, the title, I believe, was "No, You're Not Entitled to Your Opinion."
Shout out to this dude,
Yeah. What's his name again?
Patrick Stokes.
Patrick
Patrick Stokes.
Stokes.
Come on our podcast.
Come on our podcast. So what Patrick Stokes basically says in there is, look, this is a way in which people have, they politely bow out of conversations, right? When you reach an impasse where you can't agree with someone, then you say something like, well, look, I'm entitled to my opinion, you're entitled to your opinion, and then you kind of leave it
Yeah,
at that. Agree to disagree. Well, that's all well and good, but if you use that as an excuse to shelter beliefs that you should have abandoned, that's when it becomes really pernicious. And it doesn't, in a
yeah,
democracy, you can't stop people from believing whatever they want to. I mean, people shouldn't be coerced into things that they don't believe. But it doesn't mean that you deserve a platform, right? It doesn't mean that you deserve a platform to spread your misinformation. And when it comes to really dangerous things like anti-vaccinations, right? Um, there's a mountain of evidence on one side. And so when you create situations where, in the name of trying to be fair and balanced, you invite, say, an anti vaxxer onto a platform to debate a research scientist, what you're essentially doing is creating a false equivalence between those two, as if it's a difference of opinion, when in point of fact, it is a distinction between a person who knows what they're talking about and has all the evidence on one side versus someone who is spreading misinformation.
Yeah.
And that's when all of this stuff about fact v. opinion really becomes problematic, because if you're saying that it's just my opinion that vaccines don't cause autism, no, that's not the case, because we have evidence. And it doesn't matter how strong your convictions. You know, Mike, you'll appreciate this quote because it's just a history quote. So John
Ooh.
Adams, yes, John Adams, second president of the United States, he defended the British soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre. And during his defense, he stated, I think I'm quoting this
Probably
correctly.
not.
He said, "I'll enlarge upon the facts. I'll enlarge upon the evidence no further, gentlemen. Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or desires, they cannot change the state of facts and evidence." And so it should not matter how strongly you feel about something. It's perfectly fine to have strong views on things. The problem is when you have nothing else. You need to have some sort of evidence to justify your claims. And if your evidence is not accepted by the community, then maybe you're the lone genius. But
I am.
Probably not. Yeah. I don't know. This has been bothering me a lot lately, probably for no good reason. But like on the one hand, like I get that human beings just aren't really, we're not really built, like non-teleologically speaking, we're not really built to like understand and comprehend the world around us. We have, I mean, there are a lot of psychological mechanisms that are constantly working against us. Like, you know, Jared just mentioned basically like confirmation bias. Take like an intro to psych class, you'll see all this. Our minds are constantly working to like secure like a framework around us and to take information that we already like know and accept to make us feel more comfortable or whatever. But even larger than that, it seems to me that there's just a cultural climate, and maybe this is just my current perspective. Nice cupcake, Jared. Yeah, maybe
yeah,
he's
that's not a
actually
euphemism.
eating
I'm eating a cupcake.
2 cupcakes.
I'm literally eating cup. It is a fact
Is
that
it?
I have a cupcake in my hand.
All right, back to what you were saying, Mike.
No, I don't know. It just seems like I think culturally we're skewing more towards like the relativistic spectrum where fact becomes merged with opinion. And maybe this can segue into us talking about opinion / belief. But like facts nowadays seem to have the same sort of status as like somebody's opinion. And like Jared was saying, you'll see it when you see these debates, and this is a long-standing problem that people have recognized, especially within science debates, where the last big one I saw was Ken Ham and Bill Nye. Right? You have somebody on the one hand arguing for a 6,000-year-old Earth, and
Oh,
then
Jesus.
you have Bill Nye, the science guy, attempting to argue for the status of science. Right? Regardless of the participants in the debate, because of how the debate is structured, for the person who doesn't know any information, like Jared was saying, it looks as if like there's actually a difference of opinion.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and according to people like Ken Ham, like scientists disagree on this stuff. Or if you watch any like panel debate on any news channel where a climate scientist is pitted against 3 other politicians or people who are just happen to be on TV for whatever reason, it is presented to us in the media as I think it's presented to us as opinion.
Yeah, well, because it gives them credibility. It puts them on an equal playing field, as if we're supposed to take them with equal weight. I mean, how do they even shape the image of a pundit and a climate scientist talking to each other. They put one on the left and they put one on the right, and so you're supposed to weigh the options, right? As if there were, scales balancing them out somehow.
Well, I think that one of the issues with regards to this whole false equivalence business, especially when it comes to science, is that most people just don't understand how confirmation works in the context of science. So, how you never actually prove a scientific theory, you can only ever disconfirm it,
Yeah.
right? So, the rubric, the standard for verification is falsifiability, right? So if you take a theory like the theory of evolution by natural selection, could you potentially displace that theory sometime in the future? Yeah, of course you could, just like Newtonian physics was replaced by a better theory. But until you have a better theory, one which better explains the evidence, then it would be intellectually irresponsible to disregard it. And you can't merely dismiss it by saying, well, look, the evidence is still out there because maybe one day in the future it will be disproven. Well, you know what? It's lasted for over 150 years with a lot of attempts to disprove it, and it's still the best hypothesis. So a hypothesis is always provisional. You don't ever really prove science. It's always just provisional. But that doesn't mean that it's just an opinion. It means that this is the most intellectually responsible view that we can arrive at in the present moment based upon what we know.
So let's dissect opinion versus belief then, because I'm not sure. Maybe y'all can enlighten me. I'm sure you will, but I don't really see a big difference between the two. How would you define those two?
I think it's partly semantics, right? We tend to use opinion.
Raymond looks upset over there, though. I don't know.
We tend to use opinion derisively, like in a dismissive manner, like, well, it's just an opinion. Whereas belief involves some sort of conviction. I don't know. Raymond, what do you think?
I think that it's a question of degrees of your use of rationality.
How so?
It seems that a belief can have a more formed rational foundation that isn't per se based in something that's factual in the way that a scientific theory would. It builds on a little bit more of the depth of human experience, of rationality and a priori categories, like we were talking about, things that are principles of thinking or of logic, or just building off of intuitions and things like that. Opinions don't have to have any rational base to be an opinion, but a belief certainly has to have some rational base to be a belief. That's what I would say.
Well, here, I think I can make a distinction here. This is the distinction that I would want to make, is to say that opinions necessarily involve some sort of valuation, and facts don't necessarily, or beliefs don't necessarily.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. That's a good way to do it.
Let's make a distinction like this. So let's say if you were to compare Friedrich Chopin versus, the Ramones.
Who?
The Ramones.
No, the first one. The fuck you talking about, man?
Chopin. Famous 19th century composer. Anyway.
Why don't we compare like East Coast and West Coast 90s gangster rap?
No, but because that doesn't make the distinction that I'm going to make here.
Okay.
I think at an objective, factual level, you would have to say that Friedrich Chopin, as a musician, he was able to create more complex compositions, right? He was a better musician in that respect. But you could still say, well, in my opinion, I prefer the Ramones, right? Well, that's different. That's an evaluation. Objectively, Friedrich Chopin is a better musician. But when it comes to appreciating,
sounds like a snooze fest to me.
So this is why your East Coast West Coast thing doesn't work, because they could be objectively on at essentially the same level. Whereas Chopin, or you say something like, think of a painter like Caravaggio. Maybe you say, yeah, Caravaggio's great, but I really like my child's finger painting.
Jerry, man, I'm from the trailer park. I don't know who any of these people are.
You can't hide it. You can't hide behind that too. So,
we all went to the Atlanta MoMA and saw Caravaggio's.
Did we?
Yes, we did.
It's so boring, I forgot.
You probably got stuck looking at all the naked pictures.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So you can appreciate it at that level at least.
Sorry, Jared. Go ahead.
No, I'm saying that to say something's an opinion, I think necessarily involves some kind of valuation, which is beyond just the mere facts on the ground. So we could agree at a factual level, so and so is a talented painter, but you can still say, well, I think the painting sucks. And that's not saying anything about the talent. That's saying I don't value what I'm looking at.
Yeah,
Which
yeah.
is you're essentially making my point, Michael.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I could see that.
When somebody makes an opinion about something, it's an intelligible statement.
Yeah.
But it's not per se based on some sort of rational foundation. It could just be an emotional response, right? Intuitive, just
Preference, yeah.
just a straight up like, I don't like this podcast, which I'm sure we'll hear a lot of.
We already have.
It may not have any substantial rational base, right? That's what I'm
Right?
going to tell myself.
Yeah.
That these are just emotional responses.
Just a loser.
The odd thing of this, and not to take this into too weird of a direction here,
It's already weird.
but the odd thing about this is it's not just valuation in terms of preferring, music or something. If you take like Ludwig Wittgenstein's arguments in the Tractatus, which we mentioned before, if you're not familiar with it, then go check out the Tractatus
Or don't.
Logico-Philosophicus. A very,
Only read his stuff after he got shell shocked.
a very easy title to wrap your mind around. All right, or think about this: if you're a beer drinker, there's the Duck Rabbit label that you've probably seen before. That label goes back to Wittgenstein, and the point of the Duck Rabbit argument, or really any picture that you can see more than one picture if you look at it. The point is that some people just see one image, some people see the other image. It's a matter of seeing, and so you can't just say, "No, look, this is a duck." Because someone else could say, no, this is a rabbit. Well, it's kind of both. And if I can't get you to see the other thing, it doesn't mean that it's not there factually, because we're looking at the same image, but are we really? You know what I mean? We're objectively looking at the same set of facts. We're just interpreting them in a different way, which involves some sort of valuation.
But would you not say that beliefs involve some sort of evaluation also?
It depends on the belief, I think. And this is, we're getting now at the problem of just hermeneutics and the science of interpretation. Begin with, like, you could say this about the use of language, and you can muddle this really quickly, which is part of the problem, right? Because if you're being disingenuous, then you could be using this essentially as bullshit, right? That it's useful for me to muddle the facts because the facts are not in my favor, right? And that, I think, is the really dangerous bit of this sort of naive cynicism that we currently have about facts in the world, which is that people are utilizing the general distrust for the notion of facts now in order to get away with what would have in a previous generation been referred to as, objectively wrong things.
I think that
Right.
within a particular community, say a scientific community, you can have facts that are leading up towards a clear and distinct rational theory, right? But until that happens, until there is that transformation, that sort of transcendence from the data to the theoretical proposition, you're debating hypotheses. And insofar as hypotheses are being debated, there aren't clear delineations between which one is more fundamental or correct or accurate in representing a possible theory at the end of your analysis than another one. And so the question isn't whether or not these things can be debated. It's just that the facts aren't there yet, and the rational ground is. And so, in many cases, a strong hypothesis, one that you abide by, is kind of like a belief because there's a rational basis. It's thought out, and there may not be a clear direction at the moment of holding the hypothesis to be true and representative. And up until it is, you just continue to hold it as a hypothesis until it can be transcended into a theory.
Well, I asked the question because for whatever reason, and maybe I don't know what this is based on, but for me, like, when I think of opinion, I think of like basically like personal taste, right? But when I think of belief, maybe it's because I've studied religion some, but belief seems to take on a bit more of like a formal, like this is a belief system.
It's a conviction, I think,
Yeah,
is what we're
maybe
keying
a
at,
maybe
right?
a conviction. Maybe it's individual versus like communal is the dichotomy that I'm trying to make here. I don't know if that's found in anything or whatever, but like opinions seem to be like personal, whereas beliefs are somehow shared as well.
Okay, well let me pose a question then. You have two camps of scientists, and one believes in theory A, and the other camp believes in theory B.
We do like string theory versus quantum loop gravity or something.
Yeah. String theory versus loop. Do you like your matter stringy or do you like it loopy?
Loop all day.
So I think the question is in the community, I think it's fair to say that most scientists would agree that these are both reasonable and demonstrable theories within the criteria that they need to be. They're mathematically, useful. They both have some interesting experiments or evidence that are either being created to support them, or they have some already that somewhat support them.
Not
Not
string
string theory.
theory. I'm just kidding.
We already know where he falls. You likes his matter
Get all
loopy.
the hate mail.
Yeah. Right. Anyways, given a situation, though that may not be the perfect one, but given an example where there is that sort of equality of footing, when a scientist says, "Well, I think it's string theory," or "I think it's loop quantum gravity," well, what is that then? What's that judgment? Isn't that a belief?
I think at that point it is.
Yeah. What tips the indifference of equipoise? What tips your decision to go one way or the other? Or you could just be a better
Right.
scientist and just not have an opinion on either. Just be like, well, I don't believe either one. I'm just going to wait until all the facts are in, right? That's what a real scientist should do, right?
Sean Carroll.
Could be either or. Could be, yeah.
Shout out.
Well, okay, so here's the distinction. There are some things which are based on intangibles, let's say that, and some things which are based on hard evidence. So if you take like Bigfoot, since we enjoy talking about like
Yeah.
cryptozoology and conspiracy theories,
Bring out the weird stuff.
yeah, if you talk about Bigfoot,
We're talking about Bigfoot, Raymond.
since Raymond just stepped away for a second. All right, so there's no good evidence.
What?
What?
There's no good evidence to support the belief in Bigfoot. There's just not.
I beg to differ, good sir. I'm just kidding.
Calm down, Michael. There's no good.
Wait,
Jesus Christ!
before you finish, let me just say the new
How
idea
dare
about Bigfoot
you?
that I heard recently is that the reason why you can't take pictures of him is because he comes from a different dimension and he like senses the picture being taken, and so he like camouflages himself into a different dimension or some shit like that.
Yeah, at a certain point, like Occam's razor, like the law of parsimony should take over. Like if I'm having to now believe that Bigfoot is an interdimensional being who can
Yeah,
sense the presence of cameras, isn't it just easier to say that people are full of shit? Right? Like
maybe, but it's also less
It's
fun.
way, no, it's way more simplistic to think of interdimensional beings than non-existence. Let's be honest.
uh,
Sorry, Jared, you brought up Bigfoot. My mind started racing.
you completely. I knew what I was getting myself into. I shouldn't have derailed the conversation by using the example.
What was the original point?
Okay, the original point was to say that it's not a matter of opinion whether or not there's evidence for Bigfoot. There just isn't. Just like there's not
Right.
a matter of opinion whether or not vaccines cause autism. They don't. There's no evidence to support it. But there are certain things where reasonably well informed people can disagree. I
Sure.
think of an issue like abortion, right? So abortion largely hinges upon some metaphysical belief about personhood. Now, I know that there are other ways in which you can disagree about abortion, and so I'm not trying to have an abortion debate. I'm just using it as an example that fundamentally a lot of people's arguments come down to whether or not they see a fetus or a zygote or whatever
Yeah.
as a baby. And that is really a designation about personhood, right? So they could be equally well informed in terms of they understand how gestation works and all of that business. They understand how the developmental process of a fetus works. They just see it differently. And that's based upon some intangible a set of assumptions. You are, to some degree, choosing to see a fetus as a person, just like you choose to see your neighbor as a person. But you can't you can't look at personhood under a microscope because it's fundamentally a metaphysical concept.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not equally applied.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Is it's one of those things which is intangible,
Right.
which means that you can agree on facts and states of affairs vis-a-vis, the fetus, but in terms of whether or not you choose to see it in a certain way, I mean that's hard to describe why someone believes what they believe in that regard. But they could still whether or not a person is a person, that kind of is an opinion. It's a significant opinion, but it's an opinion because it has to do with valuation. It's not a mere description of the facts.
Is it an opinion or a belief? Are we going to...
Oh, Jesus.
I don't think we ever clarified that distinction, did we? I was waiting on Raymond to say something about belief.
I would say that was a belief.
I had a tidy little distinction between these involving valuation, which we have completely destroyed.
I don't know about tidy.
I think at the end of the day, we're basically saying that opinions are inconsequential beliefs. I think that's what we're really saying.
agree. We can go with it in terms of degrees.
Because it's based on metaphysical mumbo jumbo.
Opinions are inconsequential beliefs. They're incidental. They don't have to
I guess
matter.
I'll agree with y'all.
Whereas beliefs are important.
I believe in myself,
that being
though.
the case, this makes me think of
I believe in myself, though.
What? Anyway, this makes me think of W.K. Clifford, right? And the whole issue with epistemic responsibility. That's that there's.
Is he still alive?
Jesus, no. He's been dead for ages.
Michael, we generally talk about dead people.
I mean, you don't have to make fun of the dead guy.
I'm not making fun of him. I'm just saying that he's been dead for a very long time. Anyway, So W.K. Clifford famously said that it is wrong always, anywhere, and for anyone to believe anything under insufficient evidence.
Oh, that guy.
And then to illustrate this point, he utilizes the parable of the negligent ship owner, right? And so the parable goes like this, if you're unfamiliar with it.
Wait, he created the parable?
I think so. This is where I know it from.
You can't create parables after like the 2nd century.
You know what, dude?
That's like creating your own nickname or something.
It's also it's a little arrogant too,
right?
As if you're that wise, right?
I'm gonna create my own parable.
You guys are losing. You're losing the point. It's called the parable of the negligent ship owner. I don't know if he called it that. I don't recall. It's been a long time since I read this paper.
Sounds like some good marketing. We should create a parable.
Yeah. Listen to my parable.
Oh God Almighty. Anyway, we don't have infinite amounts of time to discuss this.
What was your point?
I'm trying to hurry up and get to a point. Okay, well, I'll see if I can get this in 5 minutes. The point. All right, for anyone, go and look it up since we're not going to have time to say it because I keep getting interrupted. It's just impossible.
All right, go ahead.
Well, I have to tell the story to make the point. That's the problem. Okay, so quickly, let's imagine that you are a ship owner and you're fitting out your ship for a transatlantic voyage. Now, this is expensive on the front end because you have to hire a crew, you have to get all of the merchandise. It's a bunch of build up to it. Now, let's say that on the eve of the day in which you're supposed to set sail, You have a final inspection of the ship, and you come to find out the ship is not seaworthy, right? The final inspection says, this is dangerous to take the ship out. Now, you as an interested party have a vested interest in that belief not being true, right? Or, and that not being fact. So let's say you say, well, the ship has made plenty of voyages in the past. Maybe we'll look at it when it gets back, but I really don't see what the problem is. Let's say you send the ship out and the ship sinks and everyone on board dies. Are you morally responsible? Most people would say yes, because you made a decision not based upon the facts as they were, but because you made a decision based on a belief that you wanted it to be the case, right? The facts were inconvenient, and so you decided based upon insufficient evidence. What Clifford goes one step further and says, well, even if the ship made it to port, you would still be morally responsible. The reason why is for the same conditions, right? You chose to disregard the best, most current available information because it was inconvenient. You chose a belief not based upon facts and evidence, and that was morally reprehensible. Because beliefs aren't private things. That's the ultimate argument that he's attempting to make. Beliefs have implications for behavior, and insofar as behavior impacts other people, your beliefs should be correct. In the same way that if you had a boss who was a racist or something, they may never voice that racist opinion that they have, but it's going to come out in their actions. It's going to come out in who they hire, who they fire, how they treat their subordinates, and all of that. And so beliefs are not incidental. You could also talk about vaccinations. Vaccinations are not private beliefs because they impact people, namely your children, and in the case of immunocompromised people, other people's children, right? So if you say, I'm going to doggedly stick to this irrational belief that vaccines cause autism, so I'm not going to vaccinate my child, you're opening them up to the possibility of getting measles, but not just that. You're opening up the possibility of lowering herd immunity, such that immunocompromised people, children who cannot get vaccinated because they're going through chemotherapy or they have some other issue, could become more susceptible to deadly viruses. So beliefs are really important because, if for nothing else, they impact your behavior because we act upon our beliefs.
And yeah. I think that that's all good and well, and it makes perfect sense, but there's definitely a limit to the parable. It's easy to talk about the moral responsibility when it comes to tangible things. It's harder to ask what immoral act is there involved in something less tangible.
Well, without having to rehash a second paper, William James had a famous rejoinder to Clifford's argument in Will to Believe,
Shout out.
where he's okay, without explaining all of James's point, he agrees as you do with Clifford, but he basically nuances it by saying, well, when it comes to things which are non-empirical, whether it's personhood or belief in God or whatnot, you still don't just get to believe whatever you want to. There has to be some sort of criterion. And the criterion that he established was that the belief has to be a live belief. So it's the sort of thing that you could see yourself believing, right?
Yeah.
That it's, I'm trying to think of the word. It's the sort of thing that you have to decide, right? So if I say stay in or go out, right? It's a forced belief. That's what it's called. So it has to be a forced belief. It's the sort of thing that you can't just withhold judgment on. And then it needs to be consequential in some way, right? In order to justify it. So if it's a live belief, it's the sort of thing that you could actually believe without falling into bad faith. It's forced. It's the sort of thing that you have to make a decision about, and it's momentous in some way. If you can kind of tick all of those boxes, then he thinks that you're at least within the domain of defensibility for that sort of intangible belief.
Yeah. Well, because I think that belief that if you're making the argument from a moral perspective, the sort of morally reductionist move here that seems to be permeating this discussion, beliefs are where the discussion of morality is based. So I mean, it wouldn't even make sense to talk about developing a moral perspective based off of facts. And my professional perspective there. I mean, you could talk about ethics, but that's for a different episode. Even something like a moral law, which would be the closest thing to, the grounds of morality that you could maybe call a fact. And I'm not even sure if you would say that. I mean, unless we're talking about logic and the logical laws being facts, we could talk about it in those terms. But up till now, we've been talking about it in terms of states of affairs and the empirical. But something like the moral law would still be deeply interconnected with and sort of brought into a system of belief. But anyways, I'm digressing. We're out of time, so we should probably go ahead and wrap it up.
All right. Well, I think.
Real
Yeah,
quick,
yeah. Go ahead.
not get over the fact that this man is sitting here thinking that he could just create a parable like in the 19th century. Like, who in their right mind just sits there while they're writing something is like, you know what this needs right here? A parable. Like, does he think he's Jesus or something?
All right. Well, on that note, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Peace. Create a parable.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Front Porch Philosophers. If you did, go follow us on Twitter at Philosophy Porch. If you liked it so much that you want to support us monetarily, then go to patreon.com/FPPhilosophers and become a $1 subscriber today. Every dollar goes to adding more content and buying up more server space, so the more you spend, the more you get. In any case, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the Front Porch.